Okay, today it's my great pleasure to have a special guest on today's show. Of the many challenges humanity faces today, the process of Islamization of our societies is definitely one of the biggest. Dr. Bill Warner is the founder of the Center for Study of Political Islam, the CSPI, which is dedicated to the analysis of the Islamic doctrine and the ramifications for Western civilization. Because political Islam had subjugated our other civilizations for 1400 years, and because we are in the midst of the escalating process of Islamization here in the West, Dr. Warner's mission to educate the world about the doctrine of Islamic politics through his work and research is, in my view, more important than ever before. He has written over a dozen books that make the doctrine of political Islam very easy to understand. He also developed the first self-study course on political Islam, which I highly recommend. Dr. Warner has made the three essential Muslim scriptures, the Quran, the Sirah, and the Hadith, which together form the foundation of Islam, very accessible to both Muslims and non-Muslims. There are only two ultimate authorities about Islam, Allah and Muhammad. Allah is found in the Quran and Muhammad is found in Muhammad's biography called the Sirah and in the Hadith, which contain his words and actions. The Center of Study for Political Islam approaches these three Islamic texts from the point of view of the kafir, the non-Muslim, the non-believers. Dr. Warner's mission is to educate the world about the doctrine and history of political Islam. He uses fact-based reason and logic, not opinions. His only experts are Allah and Muhammad. Everything he says and writes can be verified. Dr. Warner is PhD in math and physics, and he's a former Tennessee State University physics professor. Dr. Warner, welcome on the show. It's an honor to have you on. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, and of course, I'm feeling really good because we're going to talk about my favorite subject, which is political Islam.
Great. Well, first, I'd like to start with some words of gratitude to you on a personal level. During the past few months, I have been studying the doctrine of political Islam by doing the self-study provided by you. The self-study method is set up in such a manner that it's very easily understood by the average person like myself. I have finished the first level of the course, and now I'm working on the second level of the 4 level. I don't know if I can manage to do the 4th level, which is really for advanced academic minds, but I will try anyway. It's fascinating. By doing the fascinating self-study in the doctrine of Islam, I have not only been able to dramatically expand my personal understanding of what is going on in the external world today, it has also helped me to come to more understanding of the nature of myself as a human being. Understanding the dynamics and mechanisms of dualistic nature of Islam has helped me enormously to understand more of the nature of dualistic dynamics on a personal level. The epidemic of identification with dualistic self-centered awareness and subsequent dualistic worldviews is, in my view, one of the main causes for the unprecedented suffering we see today in this current time frame. The doctrine of Islam is an ultimate expression of dualism, which therefore can serve as the perfect tool for understanding the reality of the world around us as well as the reality of our inner worlds. Your painstaking and courageous work is a very precious gift that offers us a proper and solid diagnosis of the causal factors that have led to the current dire conditions. Your limitless and altruistic efforts have provided us with a unique tool to gain more insight on the world around us and our inner worlds. Your work can help us to free our consciousness from the poisonous shackles of dualism and to grow as human beings. So thank you for that precious gift.
Well, I'm somewhat flattered. But it is true. I think when you understand Islamic doctrine, you begin to understand humanity a little better, because some of the things that manifest in Islam also manifest in others. As you mentioned, this thing of dualism. But I find the doctrine of Islam fascinating, and it was my goal when I set out on the journey that brought me and you talking together September the 12th, 2001, that is the day after 9/11, which in America is the great divide between all studies of Islam. And my goal was to make things understandable. And so when you say that you can understand it, I'm very pleased. The easiest job I ever had in my life was for 8 years. I was a college professor, and it was like, is this legal? I mean, this is too much fun to be actually a legal act, because I love teaching. I love the moment when the eyes light up and they go, oh, now I see.
You do a great job on that, because it definitely is. It's fascinating. I mean, it's you. I mean, I won't go in too much into the psychological aspects, which are fascinating also, why it's so occulted also from our awareness, and why we don't really talk about it, what drives us. And you have a very interesting point on that, but I won't go too much into the psychological aspects today, more of getting a more understanding of the basic principles of Islam. But you did a great job in education, because I noticed that I have the ability to talk with Muslim people about Islam, where before I just didn't approach Muslim people, and let alone talk about
and by the way, I find that I had many Muslim students when I was a professor. I found that they love to discuss Islam. They're not shy about it at all.
Yeah, that's what I found as well, and especially if now that I become more aware of the trilogy of the books, what is part of the doctrine of Islam, then they immediately have interest, because they see you not only ask these direct, ridiculous questions about, is Mohammed a pedophile, all these kinds of weird questions or nothing, but if you just talk about facts and question about things which are mentioned in one of the books where we will go into, then you create interest, because what I see, there's a lot of confusion within the Muslim community as well.
Oh yes, I've talked to Muslims who say, "Oh, that's not true," when you say something about Muhammad. But the more you discuss the issue with them, you realize they've never read the Hadith, they've never read the Sirah. They're repeating what the Imam at the mosque told them, but they haven't studied it themselves. As a matter of fact, one of the most discouraging verses in the Quran is, do not ask difficult questions. This is about Islam. And as a scientist, I go, well, those are the only questions worth asking.
Yeah, you're right. So I mean, you have had this question probably 1,000 times before, but because you have a history of math, you have a PhD in math and physics. So what led you to go into religion and to which is, I think that makes your work so unique, because you apply this critical thinking process and the scientific approaches, statistical methods into this religion of Islam. But can you tell a little bit how that came to be, why you shifted to the religion of Islam, and with your background?
Well, I was raised in a very religious family. We went to church 3 times a week. And we were also, the branch of Christianity I studied emphasized the study of the text itself, the Old Testament and the New Testament. So from the age of 10 years old, I was 3 months at church would be spent in the study of New Testament, then the next 3 months on Old Testament. And this went on and on and on. And by the time I was 16, I was teaching adult Bible class. Now, this was in a very small church, let me add. So I became fascinated at an early age by the concept of sacred text. Now, by the way, being raised like this allowed me to do something that most liberals cannot do. Most liberals are progressives. When they read things in the Quran, they say, oh, they don't really believe that. Oh, nobody believes that. But what Muslims call themselves are the believers. And what you read is exactly what they believe. It may seem ridiculous to you or absurd to you, but that's exactly what they believe. So my early training allowed me to have the idea that I can step inside of someone who says it's a text-based religion and just understand it from that standpoint. So as a matter of fact, I find it very fascinating to talk to Muslims about Islam.
I can imagine, because it's a very confusing doctrine. It's full of contradictions. It's full of, that's maybe a good starting point also for what is Islam exactly? What would you consider to be Islam?
the fundamental question, and you'd be amazed how many people cannot answer this question. Now, Muslims can. Islam is the doctrine found in the Quran and the Sunnah of Muhammad. That's it. If it's in the Quran or the Sunnah of Muhammad, and the Sunnah of Muhammad is his biography, the Sirah, and his traditions of Hadith, if it is in those three books, then it is Islam. Equally important, if it is not found in those three books, no matter how great it sounds, it is not Islam. So Islam is like a box, and everything is in those three books. And so therefore, I always return to those three books to answer all questions. For instance, can you de-radicalize a Muslim? Well, let's first talk about what radicalization means in the context of those three books. So I've tried to run everything through those. And as I point out to people, there's only two experts, Muhammad and Allah. So your Muslim friend may say things that are very attractive, but if they don't agree with Muhammad and Allah, then they're simply not Islam, whether you know, no matter how much you like them.
Yes. So you say that's true. It's full of dualism. There is a peaceful Islam. There's a peaceful Mohammed. There's a peaceful. There are actually two Korans. There's an early
Correct.
Quran and a later Quran.
Correct.
The early Quran was more peaceful, more religious, and the later Quran, which of course, if you don't know that's why the context you provide is so crucial, because without this context, historical context, and the context which are contained in the Sirah, the life of Muhammad, and in the Hadith, it's impossible to understand the Quran. I also understand that the Quran is made up in such a way that it doesn't start from the beginning of the life of Muhammad to the end of the life of Muhammad, but more to the length of the chapters, and in a very, very not logical way.
Yes, it is. And it's a rather odd thing. I tell people the Quran is like a detective mystery novel that you cut the spine off, and then you rearranged all the pages in the novel so that the longest chapter was up front and it went down to the shortest chapter. Well, if I gave you this book now, it's rebound with the chapters reordered, and say, here's a great book. And then a month later I say, did you read the book? You go, no, I couldn't make any sense of it at all. Because no, you couldn't. The story has been removed from the Quran that you get at the bookstore. Now the story can be added back to it, but Muhammad and Allah track together. So whatever Muhammad needs, Allah grants. As a matter of fact, there's a verse in the Quran to that issue. Muhammad had an attraction to a certain woman, and she was beyond the bounds of what was legal sex, but then there's a verse in the Quran which says, no, you can have her for a wife. And Aisha says, your Lord is quick to grant you your wishes. And when you line up the Quran and Muhammad's life together, you see that, and they're like this, you see that everything can be explained through the Muhammad, but no one can understand the Quran without Muhammad. No one. It is simply not possible to do because there's no story. But when you add the story back to it, the Quran starts off with a hymn to God and ends with political triumph over all the world. So it becomes an epic story.
So would you say that all the Imams have read all the scriptures? I mean, they know the context, they know how to fit it together, or would it be possible that there are a lot of Imams preaching in mosques or are not aware of this? Sorry, go ahead.
I can't answer your question because there are many grades of Imams. You can have a storefront mosque in which the man who is Imam leading the prayers is not actually a scholar of Islam. He's simply a leader for prayer. And you can call him an Imam. But what we want to, now all scholars of Islam have studied it. If you remember Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, he gave his talk that he gave when he assumed power was the same talk that Abu Bakr gave when he assumed power when Muhammad died. So, but anyway, I love the history of all this. And the dualism, let's point out something. Most of the time when people want to talk about something about Islam that they know is good, they state what is good, and then they presume, well, see, if you accept what I've said as good, then Islam is good. not understanding that Islam exists in a situation where Muhammad and the early preacher of peace, that's true, but it's also true that he was a jihadist and a politician. Now, those two things may contradict, but they do not mean the other one isn't true, because after all, Muhammad is the perfect man leading the perfect life. So if he led his life that way, then that is what Islam is.
Yes, and I mean, every Muslim, no matter if it's Sunni, Shia, or Wahhabi, they have this moral obligation to put effort in trying to copy the life of Muhammad. Is that true? Is that, or is that in different?
Yes. There's one subtle variation here. The Shia do not accept the hadith that the Sunnis do. And the reason is many of the Sunni hadiths were relayed by Aisha. Well, Aisha was the enemy of Ali, and Ali is the grand imam of the Shia sect. So therefore, they reject the Sunni hadith because they came through Aisha. But here's the important thing. When it comes to the doctrine as it applies to you and me, the kafir, the significant differences are almost not there. That is, as far as we're concerned, the Sunni and the Shia are both jihadists, and so the jihadist is to wage against the kafir. So what difference does it make whether it's Sunni or Shia?
Yeah.
But they have disagreements among themselves, and as you know, they kill each other with... I did a study one time of those who have died in Islam since 9/11. For every kafir, an unbeliever that dies, there are 2 Muslims that die. And the way part of this happens is a Muslim can't kill another Muslim. So why do they kill another Muslim? Well, they kill them because they're not real Muslims. So there is a jihad of purification, if you will, when one Muslim kills another because he wasn't practicing the real Islam.
Yes, that's very interesting because a lot of people, that's the question, how can that be? And they kill each other, and it's one big, not very coherent, but at a from a certain perspective, it's very coherent. But of course, it contains these contradictions at the same time, and they're killing, fighting each other. So that's a very interesting point you bring up there, that so many Muslims are actually killed. You see it with ISIS, Al Qaeda, all these extremist Islamic groups who are killing also of Muslims. So would you say that these kinds of groups are actually following the Sunnah to the greatest detail, actually, to the greatest detail, in the purest form, actually, other than they extremist or whatever? Like you are being labeled actually sort of extremist, but that's the same. You just explain to the detail what Islam is and what it contains, and then you're an extremist.
We must face this issue. The word extremist does not appear in Islamic doctrine. The word extremist is put together by those who wish to sugarcoat Islam. So when someone, if a Muslim captures a woman and rapes her, and she's a kafir, then that's not extremism, because Muhammad did. Look, if Muhammad did it, it is not extreme. It is, of all things, normal. All right? So what we call extremists really should be more devout. And if you want to meet a real scholar of Islam, talk to a jihadi imam. Oh, by the way, did you know that I'm approved as a teacher of Islam by a former member of Al Qaeda? I had an email come in from a guy, and he said, "My name is such and such. I am from Denmark originally, and when I was in prison, he was a biker, a tough guy. And when I was in prison, the strongest man in the prison was a Muslim. And so I said, well, I want to know what he's doing." So he converted to Islam, but when he left prison, he then wound up going to Yemen, where his imam was I'll think of it in a moment. Anyway, he was an Al Qaeda imam. And then he left Islam because he couldn't stand the killing of innocents. That is, killing women and children. He never could make that his peace within himself. So he left Islam. So he's now an apostate from Islam. But anyway, he wrote me a letter one time and said, "Your understanding of Islam is exactly correct. My Imam Alawaki," that was his name, "taught the same Islam that you teach. So what people say that you don't know Islam, I say, sir, that you know Islam exactly, correctly, proper." So Therefore, I'm probably the only man you've ever met who is Al-Qaeda approved.
And a kafir.
Right.
Well, I guess that's a big compliment.
Well, I take it as a compliment, actually.
Yeah, I can understand that.
But I don't know of anybody else who is Al-Qaeda approved.
I've not heard anyone before who is Al-Qaeda approved. So what would you say then, because Islam is clearly not only a religion, that's just a part of it.
Oh, the least important part of Islam is the religion from my standpoint. I'm a kafir, a non-Muslim, because a religious Muslim, the first level of being a Muslim is to do the prayers, declare the Shahada, which is there is no God but Allah, Muhammad is his messenger, give the zakat, fast during Ramadan, and then go to the Hajj in Mecca. So if you do those things, you're a good Muslim, but you are not a complete Muslim, because the other part that you need to practice is the jihad. And jihad, now let me be very clear here, comes in many forms and fashions. So now, what was your original question? Because I think I've lost it.
Well, I asked that the religion is only one part of Islam. It's not only a religion.
Right. But now, so the second part, which makes you a more pure Muslim, involves jihad, which involves me. Let me be clear, on the religion of Islam, I don't care whether a Muslim prays 5 times a day or never at all. I simply don't care. I don't care if they pray facing Mecca or if they pray passing Malaysia. I simply don't care. Those things are the religious part of Islam. What I care about is the part of Islam that deals with me and you, which is the non-Muslim, the kafir. And at one time, I'm sort of notorious for doing statistical studies of text. And so I went through the Quran, the Sirah, and the Hadith and sorted it into 2 parts, that dealt purely with religion and that also dealt with the kafir, the non-Muslim, which I call political Islam because it's not religious Islam. 51% of the text of Islam involves the kafir. So therefore, the majority of Islamic text is about politics, not religion. And by the way, if anybody ever says to you that Islam is a religion, you know you're dealing with someone who does not know much about Islam at all, because all Muslims claim that Islam is a complete way of life, a complete civilization. So therefore, just that. It's a complete civilization. It's not a religion. And if someone says it's a religion, they don't know what they're talking about.
Yeah, so what we now see here in the West, in Europe, I don't know how it's in the United States, but now it becomes so in your face, visible, but still, where before it was a sort of stealth operation, which still was visible, but now, for instance, in Holland, you have there was a recent uproar because there are over 60 Muslim schools in Holland. And there were some journalists who exposed this school in Amsterdam they were preaching Salafistic doctrine of Islam with violence against kafir, beheadings and promotion of stoning of homosexuals. So it was a big uproar. But the liberal mayor, Jewish woman, she's also a woman even, she said, well, this is it's a problem, but we shouldn't label it, and this is just the same kind of rhetoric, apologizing for it. But this is just a madrasa. It's a sort of Quran school, literally, in Holland, while at the same time mosques are popping up everywhere. This is political Islam, is it?
Yes. Now, by the way, let me give you an example of the difficulty of sorting out politics and religion. What we have in the United States now, and I know it happens in England and perhaps it happens in the Netherlands as well, is that Muslims will commandeer the street and do prayers in the streets. Have you ever seen that?
Yes.
Now then, people would say, well, they're praying, therefore it is their religion, they can do that. No. Prayer is religion. Commandeering the street is a political action. You see the difference here? So if you and I are in Amsterdam and we with a dozen other people block off a street, we'll soon meet some police who don't have any sense of humor. And yet if you're Muslims and we're praying, they say, well, I mean, we can't stop you from blockading the street. So we need to sort out politics from religion and leave the religion alone. But I think that the law should be applied to Muslims who are praying in the streets, because they need to respect our laws as much as we do.
Yes, and the same applies for the explosion of violence. Actually, violence, especially against women, rapes and everything in Sweden, Norway, but also in Holland, you have a lot of violence of Muslim youngsters against Dutch, European, Western youngsters, and they're just applying an amazing amount of violence. But if you understand where this comes from, their operating system, from the books and the Sunnah and the life of Muhammad and these kinds of things, that this is actually part of the doctrine of jihad, and they see this as a noble thing, because they imitating the life of Muhammad as he saw the kafir, and like they copy it.
Yes. I mean, Muhammad would send men out with orders to kidnap, kill, and bring back slaves. Now, if this is done by just one or two people, how is that different from just an ordinary crime? So crime is built into the jihad doctrine. Now, you're not supposed to commit crimes as a Muslim just in order to get rich, but you are to commit crimes, and what we would call crimes, in order to subjugate the Muslim, because that's just another form of jihad. And there are many forms of jihad, many forms. The least harmful, by the way, is the one we pay attention to, the sword, jihad of the sword, or the truck, or the machete, or whatever you want to call it, because those are actually the least dangerous forms of jihad. We have people who are police who can deal with that to some degree. But what the more important forms of jihad are those who are changing our civilization. For instance, in America, it used to be that we had a robust freedom of speech. But now then, if you actually use your freedom of speech, you'll discover that now then you said, well, no, you're hurting minorities. And therefore, what you're doing is hate speech. And I ask the people who say that I'm indulged in hate speech, well, am I using hate facts? Is truth a defense against the charge of hate speech? And we're seeing that there's an erosion there. So I have a great concern here, because one of the most important freedoms that we have is the ability to say what we think. And when you control language, you control thought. And so therefore we see that in America, we're losing some of our most precious ideas. And I know, of course, that the same thing is happening in Europe. But because when you can no longer speak, you're no longer free. And if you're no longer free, are you really a true human being?
Right. But it becomes more Sharia law compliant, actually. If I see this, how they apply this double standards. I was in the UK last month, and there was a postcard shop, and there was one section which was completely about Christ bashing and Christ ridiculing Christmas and rude text on it, all funny, considered funny. I think if you have one small section about Muhammad or the Prophet, about bashing, then your shop will be burned down, and then you will be arrested. So that is in line with Sharia law. Would you say that Sharia law, which, by the way, surveys have showed that over 70% of the Muslims want Sharia law here, because for them it's the only law, it's the law of God. So how can they accept another law if they're conditioned with this doctrine? But would you say that Sharia is sort of infiltrating the laws of the land, the common law, but also the constitutions here and the law, without seeing it actually, because people see it's.
Let me give you an example. My daughter lives in Illinois. Her child, she has 3 kids, and 2 of them brought home notes from school that said, do not send your children to school with gummy bears or marshmallows. Now, gummy bears are a soft, chewy candy. And my daughter goes, what? What's up with this? So she went to see the school board. And they finally, after she had to drag that out of them, but they said, well, look, Muslims have come by and have said that gelatin is in marshmallows and gummy bears, and that violates their dietary laws. And so therefore they don't want their children to be around them. So therefore, because Sharia law won't allow pork products to be eaten by Muslims, no one gets to eat pork products in the school. This is an application of Sharia law. Now, you'll meet defenders of Sharia law saying, well, it's just like British canon law, or Catholic canon law, or like Jewish law, halakha. Well, Jewish law says that Jews cannot eat pork, but it does not say that non-Jews have to avoid pork. But in Islam, what we say is Muslims can't eat pork, nor can the kafir. So the rules apply everywhere. So it's something as small as a marshmallow is a weapon of war. And it now just starts to destroy our own ability to, because this business of what's being done in the schools with the marshmallows, what's also happening is the school textbooks have to be changed to accommodate what Muslims want. So therefore, we see that we're slowly losing our civilization in ways that are very important, but seemingly innocuous. Marshmallows, I mean, how important can marshmallows be? Well, the marshmallows are very important because they tell us which way the wind is blowing.
Yes, and these things on itself, they look sort of harmless, and then people justify it. Oh, it's only this. But I recall in one talk you spoke about the fact that Muslims use for their agendas calendars, and we use watches. I found it a very good one, because we want quick results and we want to see it fast, and they have enormous patience in the process of taking over or of spreading this doctrine. If you see it for the past 1400 years, it has been enormous successful. I mean, that's another thing, because a lot of people say, oh, 9/11 and it's an inside job and all these things. We're talking about Islam now. The history of Islam goes back 1400 years. Since 9/11, there were like 35,000 jihadi terror attacks, as if this is all false flag or another thing. But it is a sort of, if it's for 1400 years ongoing, there's an enormous patience and no rush, because that's the success of it also partly, that it's not a quick thing.
Let me give you an example of their patience and thinking, and then I want to discuss how it gives them a great morale. My wife is a fan of foreign flicks, foreign movies, and the Bulgarians did one about the Ottoman Empire invading Bulgaria. And in it, a Christian is forcibly converted to Islam. And the Christian says to his neighbor, who is a Muslim, he says, I don't really believe this. I'm doing it just to be safe. And the Muslim tells him, it does not make any difference whether you believe it or not at all. Because here's what will happen. Your children will go to Muslim schools, and then they will grow up being a stronger Muslim. Their children will grow up within the Muslim community. By the time the third generation is around, you will never be remembered. You will be completely forgotten. So here is a patience of willing to wait for 3 generations to convert and make a real Muslim. We don't have that kind of patience. And by the way, this leads to enormous optimism for Muslims, because since it doesn't matter whether it happens in this generation or the next generation, if there's a big setback, so what? Whereas with the Kafirs, I mean, we talk in terms of losers. Oh, Sweden is gone. The UK is overrun. North Africa has already taken over France. So what we do is we talk in very discouraged manner, and whereas Muslims always are very optimistic, because they may be losing now, but it's going to win later. And we don't. One of our biggest problems is that we have in our minds resolved that we, in this intellectual struggle, we want to tie, because we want to be nice, but the Muslims want to win. And these are very different attitudes.
Yeah. If you're okay, I want to read a little piece from one of the books. This is the book of Sharia law. There's one of the books of the self-study course. You see, it's not a thick book for the people who think we're lazy. It's very easy and it's fascinating. But there's one piece which I like to read, and then you can respond on it, because I think it's an essential part, and it ties into what we're talking about. Kafir leaders I don't think only the leaders, but most Kafirs know nothing about Islam and Sharia law. They all have met nice Muslims, so they think that Islam must be good and the troublemakers must be extremists. Kafir leaders, and most other Kafirs, know nothing about dualistic ethics and political submission. The prime motivation of Kafir leaders is to be nice and play the role of tolerant host to these new guests. The second motivation is not to say or do anything that will cause them to be labeled a bigot. The master plan of the Kafir leadership is that if we are nice, Muslims will see how good we are and will reform Islam. But if your goal is to implement Sharia law, and the process of applying Sharia law has worked without fail for 1400 years, why reform what is not broken? Sharia cannot be reformed, it's Allah's law, therefore it's perfect, universal and complete. I think that's a very powerful and essential in the whole doctrine of political Islam, what's happening and what is facilitating this process as well. That,
yes.
Could you say? Well, I mean, it's of course one of the main causes is the ignorance of Islam. That's why I recommend your self-study again. It's fascinating on all levels, and it's very easy to understand. And if you do the first two parts only, already you're able to have enough knowledge to communicate. Because I think that's I don't know how you see that. From a solution-based perspective, communication is crucial in this. I think with also with Muslim people and other people to understand firstly what it is.